about you on dark nights. I think about you when I see your light. Dark star. Dark star in the night.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Hal Sterripp. I'd like to welcome all of you to this virtual presentation. We're going to be having Joanna Aiton-Kerr speaking later on. Now, basically, I want to acknowledge Stephen Thomas, who's helped us get this event set up. For the first time I met Stanton up at his place, not far from the University of New Brunswick, it's up on the hill, right here in Fredericton. I'm a soldier, and I had a particular reason for wanting to get into this whole business in the first place. To me, is there something that's liable to threaten us? If so, how do we deal with it? If they're not trying to threaten us, what are they doing here? Stanton always asks three specific questions. Where are they from? Why are you here? How do you operate? Anyway, he was a rather sharp cookie, I got to tell you that. So when we sat down to talk, he was checking me out. What are you really here for? Are you going to make fun of me? Are you trying to be a sarcastic, whatever? And we won't use any of those words. And of course, I'm looking at him. Is he the real McCoy, or is he just trying to make a buck off of this? There's a difference between Fox News and CNN. We're sitting in his home, and it's got this funny little corner that's set up with all the books and little dealy bobbies, you know, the little UFO toys and the little alien gimmicks and stuff. And I'm looking at this stuff and I'm thinking, what is this? That's not what I'm expecting here. And he just laughed because he has a sense of humor. And he said, look, I've been traveling all over the world there, going to people's place for interviews. I happen to like it here in Fredericton. If they want to interview me, they can come here. So I got this place set up so they can put their cameras over there and their microphones over there, and I've got a background for it. But I'm looking at him and said, this just isn't you. And where's you? And he said, you come with me. So we walk down to the hallway there, and he opens the closet door, and it's the door down into the basement. And as he heads down the stairs sideways, I've got to turn sideways too. And the reason is because on each side of the steps are papers stacked almost to the ceiling, taller than I could reach in some cases. How he was getting them all there without knocking it over every time I went down, I don't know. We get down into the basement, and there's boxes and more boxes and more boxes and boxes, and they all got stuff in them. And there's a desk somewhere under a pile of papers. And they're looking at it saying, how can you work like this? He suddenly reaches into a box without looking and pulls out a book and scribbles, there you go, Hal, have a nice little souvenir. Which means he knew where everything was. He didn't even have to look. He knew where the stuff was. So when he gave this stuff to us, you can't imagine the amount of it. Poor Joanna is going to have to deal with it because it took 5 truckloads to get this stuff to the provincial archives. 5 truckloads, not to mention the little artifacts and things that he gave us, which we've used for exhibit downtown. The person who's got to sort this out is Joanna. And I need to tell you a little something about her story. Oh my gosh. She's originally from Woodstock. Right off the bat, that makes you good people. She likes dogs and cats. I'll forgive her for that. She doesn't like pigs. And that's a long story we'll save for another time. In any event, she decided to become an archivist at a very young age while she was visiting her family friend. She worked at Acadia University in their archives. The thought of a life where she could read other people's diaries and get paid for it sounded pretty amazing to her when she was just 8 years old. So after earning her BA in history at Acadia, Joanna attended the University of British Columbia, had to get as far away as she could for a little bit of a change in the head, I guess. Anyway, 20 years as an archivist. She's worked at a variety of institutions in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but has been at the Provincial Archives here in Fredericton there for 10 years. This is where she's now the deputy director. Nothing in her career prepared her for the Stanton Friedman records, but it has been a challenge, and she's thoroughly enjoyed it. She currently lives here in Fredericton with her husband, 2 teenage daughters, and a black lab mix and a cat. And welcome, Joanna, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And I am going to begin to share my screen. So everybody can see that now. Nod your head, Hal, if you can see it. Yep, great, perfect. Okay. So yes, I'm very glad to be speaking with you tonight about the Stanton Friedman Collection at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. And the first word that you see on your screen there that you might not be familiar with is fond. That's just a fancy archival word that really means records. That's what we call it. MC 4244 just means it's the 4,244th collection of privately held records to come to the provincial archive. So that's all that means. Okay, let's take it away. So first, I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. We are located in Fredericton on the UNB campus, but we're not part of UNB. A lot of people get confused about that. We're actually part of the Government of New Brunswick in the Department of Finance and Treasury Board. We get bounced around a lot, but that's where we've been for a while, and I think we'll stay there for a bit. So the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick has a very broad mandate under the Archives Act, and we like it broad. It pretty much means we can choose what we want. So the mandate is to acquire, preserve, and make available to the public records with a bearing on the history of New Brunswick. A lot of the records that we have are actually government records, and they come to us just as a matter of course. So records of the Office of the Premier, Department of Justice, Department of Health, Transportation, you name it, that sort of thing. But we're also the largest repository in the province for records that were created privately by non-government sources. So that could be records of businesses, charities, religious organizations, individuals like Stanton, and families. So there's diaries, correspondence, business ledgers, minutes of corporations, all sorts of different things. But Stanton's records fall under the private sector section, and I was the manager in 2019 of that section when we made the decision to acquire Stanton's records. I've often been asked why the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick would have been interested in the records of an American-born nuclear physicist and ufologist, because it doesn't really fit with a lot of people's thoughts about what an archives collects, traditional sort of things like genealogy records or records about the loyalists or court records. Well, the Provincial Archives aims to document the lives of the ordinary and the extraordinary. And Stanton, he was famous, a very interesting individual, lived in our province for more than 30 years. So the documentation about his life's work fit our mandate. It really wasn't too much of a question in my mind. So beyond fitting our mandate, which was important, we had to consider what sort of commitment we were looking at if we were to acquire these records at the Provincial Archives. I know of no other archives in the province, maybe even the country, that would have been able to do it. And I'm not saying that because of the content, although that would rule out quite a few institutions. For example, the University of New Brunswick Archives has a very clear mandate to acquire records of the university, and they also acquire literary papers of New Brunswick authors. This would not have fallen in within their collection mandate. I suspect the Fredericton Region Museum would have been interested, but wouldn't have the capacity to be able to store and sort through them. So it really did limit the playing field for who would be able to take them. I suspect that some institutions in other parts of the world might have been interested, perhaps Roswell or the Archives of the Unexplained in Sweden, but the logistics of such a transfer would have been pretty complicated and have a pretty hefty price tag. So when I thought about this acquisition, I considered it an archival responsibility. Archives are here to preserve records of historic value for research purposes and to make sure that they're preserved and made available. So even though we knew this would be daunting, it was a no-brainer. It was an archival responsibility. Stanton was looking for a place to take his records, and he wanted it to happen soon. This was in January of 2019. It was actually Melinda who tipped us off. that he was looking for a home for his records. So after she told us, my colleague Josh went to visit Stanton, who just lived a few streets away from the archives, just to get an idea of the scope. And I distinctly remember Josh coming back and telling me, there's a lot of stuff, lot of papers. And I said, well, how much is a lot? Well, a few rooms. I've been an archivist for 20 years. I've seen a lot of things. And I thought, oh, a few rooms, that's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. When I actually got there myself, I was like, oh, this is, he could have mentioned that things weren't in filing cabinets. That would have helped, but that's fine. He still works for us. We didn't fall out over it. But there was still no question in my mind that we take them. The records needed a home. I think sometimes people think that there would have been a lot of song and dance and back and forth and wrangling and talking and trying to convince Stanton to give us our records, but his records, but it really was not that way at all. It was a pretty informal conversation. He's like, would you take them? Like, yes, we would take them. Will you make them available? Yes, we'll do our best to make them available. Okay. And then he signed the donation form, and that really was the extent of the legality of donating the records to us. So the paper was signed, and we picked up the first batch of records that month in January 2019. Stanton was there. He was there for the first few pickups, standing, talking to us, telling jokes, and giving us instructions on what we could take and what he was still working on. And it was usually pretty vague. He's like, well, I'm working on this stuff over here. Like, okay, but what's the boundary? Because we're not quite sure, but we knew to leave his desk in an area behind the desk. And it was a lot of fun having him there telling us jokes as we were working through. I remember one incident where a staff member picked up a paper mache mask of some sort, and someone asked him, are you sure you want us to take this? This is really quite a neat little thing. He's like, well, I don't wear it very much anymore. It was just funny and quite delightful. So yes, we decided to take them. It was our responsibility, we felt, but the bigger question was not, are you going to take them? It was, how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to get this work done in light of all of the other work that we have to do? So this gives you an idea of what the state of the records were when we started to pick them up. And this is just like a quarter of one of the rooms. So if you can just imagine this duplicated in all four corners, floor to ceiling, as Hal said, and then sort of like moving down so that there was a little footpath in the middle of the room. So floor to ceiling. And then there were two other rooms with, I would say one of them was half full, and then the other room was about a third full, like because there were Christmas decorations and other things. It was just storage. And in one of the rooms, that's where most of the older records were kept. So things from earlier in his career, and they were way in the back, several shelves deep. And so we had to do some acrobatics to get things out of there, but it was a good staff bonding experience. We'll look at it that way. We knew right away that the first challenge for us after getting it out was going to be space. And I don't mean space to store it, I mean space to actually do the work. At the archives, we don't have anywhere near adequate space to store and sort all of this material in one foul swoop. And so we had to do it in phases, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Well, actually, I'll talk about it right now. We knew we couldn't do it in one go. And so in January of 2019, sorry, we had 6 interns with us through the Young Canada Works program. And we thought this is a good introduction for them, these young people who are interested in being archivists. We'll take them with us and they can help us box it up and sort it. So we took 6 interns with us, and we made a couple of trips with them until the end of March. And then we had 15 summer students helping us in the summer, 4 students again in the fall, plus the regular and contract staff at the archives who didn't have allergies or any physical limitations, because there's a lot of bending and lifting and lugging. So we worked out a process, and that process was rent a cargo van, drive the van over, fill up the van, make a lot of boxes. Actually, we had a group of archivists who were just making boxes, others who were loading the stuff into the boxes, and then people loading the boxes into the cargo van. So we did that 5 times. Just skip. Weeding out duplicates and things like that as quickly as possible, just so that we could make more space as the boxes started to come in. Stan's death did led to a bit of a pause in the process. So we kind of caught up on the records that had already come into the archives during that phase. And then we started to go back in early October as the family was preparing to sell their home. So the picture that you see in front of you now is, that would be not quite a full cargo van full. You can see it goes all the way into the back there, but that gives you an idea of what we were lugging in. And at one point we had records stashed in several different rooms in the archives, much to the staff's delight. We had some in the loading bay. We had to store some in what we call the link area, and you'll see that in another slide. The exhibit room, we had actually closed down the exhibit room that year to accommodate student space and larger projects. And so there were a lot of boxes there. In the private sector workroom, we filled that up. And there were also quite a few boxes of records in conservation. Because having been stored in a basement for so many years, of course, you have issues like sometimes there'd be a bit of mold or some water damage or pest damage and rust damage from paper clips and things like that. So this is one of our teams working away on the records. So this picture shows some students and archivists in we call it the link, because it links the old section of the archives to the new, it was built in about 2003, I think. So it's a working area for staff, and it's where boxes come out of the repository when they're going to be taken upstairs for researchers to work on. So we did this. We'd bring the cargo van in, and then the next day we would just start going through the records. Weeding out those duplicates, weeding out things like, it was his office. So you'd find things like granola bar wrappers and whatnot. He's working, he's eating. So just getting rid of some of the things like that. But as you can probably imagine, starting a process like this with so many hands involved was going to lead to some problems. I mean, it was good because we had to move the records quickly because we needed to free up space in the loading bay and other areas. But if we're looking for duplicates, Briar, who's on the left-hand corner, isn't going to know if she's looking at the same record as Hannah, who's there in the back, right? So even though we were doing a sort, it was just the first layer of sorting. So many eyes, many hands made the work go faster, but we're nowhere near discarding records that won't be kept in the long run because they're copies. Another issue that we quickly identified is that there could be pages of the same record in many different boxes. So there could be page 1 of a letter or a document in one box. There could be 5 pages of the same document, different pages in a different box. So like records, one document could be broken up between many different boxes. And so this is really just the first layer of sorting. It's going to take many additional sorting processes to try and reconstruct documents. We did adapt our sorting process fairly quickly. So initially it was just to do the first weeding through and to rebox things so that we could store them in our climate controlled repository. because we wanted to have things in a climate controlled, secure area as quickly as possible, and then bring out boxes to work on as we had the time and the space. But as we sorted through, we started to notice categories. And I'm not talking about categories as in topics, because archives don't organize records according to topics. So even when we're done this process in probably 10 years, all of the Roswell related records are not going to be together. All of the Betty Hill documents are not going to be together. FBI right to information requests are not going to be together. In archives, we separate records according to function. So for a business, say we had business records, those would be divided into minutes and agendas. There'd be financial records. There could be some promotional material, newsletters. It's the same when we're organizing records that are documenting an individual's life. And I'll talk more about the series or the functions that we identified in Stanton's life, but just very quickly, there would be his personal records. So records that don't really have anything to do with his research and his career, but records, personal correspondence, records pertaining to his family. And then there are his research records pertaining to UFOs. There's his research pertaining to things like radon. So I forget what we call that. I think it's more like scientific. We had UFO and then we had scientific. There's fan mail. There's records pertaining to his career as a lecturer. So just many different series, which I'll talk about more in a few slides. So to date, a lot of the initial weeding has been completed, and there are small parts of the collection that are findable, mainly the publications, because those are easy to deal with. As of today, there are 361 containers of records, and the containers that you see in the back here, that's the size of the containers that we're talking about. So if you were to line those containers up in a long line, a long linear line, it would measure 72.2 meters. That's how archives say how much volume there is. They don't go by number of pages. They would go by number of photographs, but for documents, it's how much space does it take up on the shelf? And in this case, it's 72.2 meters. Not all of those 361 containers have yet been sorted into those rough categories, but a good number have. And so that's really going to be the process for the foreseeable future. It's picking up an unsorted box, and as you can see in this image, we've got these boxes with the sticky notes on them with piles of papers being sorted. They're horizontal. That is the way that that's the way that we're sorting. You take an unsorted box, and then each box on that table is labeled with a category, and we just put the individual pieces of paper in like that. So the next step will be, once we're through all those 361 containers, is to retrieve from the repository, say, all of the personal records, and then sort those further and divide those into further categories. Same with the research, same with records pertaining to his career as a lecturer. Like maybe we'll have his itineraries in one series, and then there'll be his lecture notes in another series, and then we'll have PowerPoint presentations. So it's just going to be continual sorting until we get into a logical, accessible sequence of files. We'll be talking to other archivists who have dealt with similar types of records as we go through the process. It's pretty typical for archivists to not be subject matter experts when they acquire records. Nobody at PANB, Provincial Archives, including myself, anywhere near being a subject matter expert with this, but we learn as we go. And very quickly, one of our summer students started to make, and I'll just hold it up here, we called it a Stan cheat sheet. And she broke down the common terms and acronyms that many of us had not been familiar with before, as well as names of people, the names that we kept seeing over and over so that we would all know, oh, okay, Betty Hill, Barney Hill, Don Menzel, and then we'd know who they were so we could place those records into their proper context as quickly as possible. One archivist who we've been talking to fairly often is Klas Svan in Sweden, and he's the archivist at the Archives for the Unexplained, and he's already been a great help. There's a list of over 350 publications that's now accessible, and hundreds of magazines as well. One question that I get very frequently is, when is all of this going to be available online? When are we going to digitize it and put it online? And my answer is always the same. It's just not in the cards right now. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money to digitize, and there's really no point in digitizing things in the state that they are right now. We don't want to digitize things that aren't going to be kept because they're duplicates. It's a process that we have to go through first. Also, the resources just aren't available. Digitization does cost a lot of money, and so many of the grants that are available to archives wouldn't necessarily cover this sort of work. So I'd like to be able to do it and put it online. Perhaps at some point we'll be able to digitize portions of it, but not in the foreseeable future. So this is just a shot that I took yesterday to show we have a summer student who's doing a lot of the sorting right now. So you can see the boxes quite clearly there with the different categories. The names that we're using right now probably aren't going to be the official names of the series that we've identified. We kind of made them fun to keep ourselves feeling a bit lighthearted as we go through this mass of records, because it does feel overwhelming a lot of the time. So we've got friends and foes there. Those are regular correspondents, sometimes friendly, sometimes not so friendly. And sometimes they were friendly and became a little less friendly as the relationship went on. Science Stan would be research that's not necessarily UFO related. And then we've got the publications and so on. This is an example of a container that has gone through the first level of sorting. So it's gone from the boxes that we retrieved from Stan's house into, I think these ones, I think that one might be either fan mail. I think it's fan mail. And so those are just letters that people sent to Stan saying, I know I saw a show that you were on, or I caught your lecture at such and such a place, really enjoyed it. And sometimes sharing a bit of information that they know. So that's sort of, that's the state. So I get questions like, do you know if there's anything in there about when Stan spoke in Pasadena back in 1984? I'm like, I don't know that yet, because this is what we're still dealing with right now. We're just not at that level of sorting. This is the goal. This is what we want things to look like in the end. So these aren't perfectly sorted records yet, but this does give you a visual of what we want it to be in the end. These are actually records that went through the conservation process. They were probably, I think they were either water or mold damaged. And we have a conservator on staff and a conservation lab complete with fume hoods and all of those things. So these are records that were cleaned. You can, if you squint, you can probably see some of the titles there. So pamphlets and publications by Dr. Richard Haynes about UFO appearances 1979, articles, correspondence, posters, re-UFOs, and biographical material about Stan. So my guess is that that was a folder that was in a filing cabinet, and it was just all taken out, cleaned, and given a generic title. So even that's not truly accessible yet. So that kind of gives you a quick walk through the process, such as it is. But I wanted to touch briefly on acquiring this gave us a bit of unexpected fame that I wasn't prepared for. As I mentioned earlier, when we acquired the records, Stanton made it very clear that he wanted everything to be made available. He understood that it would take quite a bit of time. And I remember very well going into the room for the first time with him, and he looked at me sort of half apologetically and said, "Well, you know, I don't have a secretary." Like, yeah, no, you obviously don't have a secretary. It gave me a good laugh. But um, so because we had made that promise to him that we would make the records accessible to the public, I wanted it to be known to the general public that his records had been acquired and were being safely stored at the provincial archives, in case people who knew him or were interested in his work should wonder. So I had an interview with a local CBC radio show, CBC Shift. We have an ongoing series with Vanessa Vandervalk on that show, just about things happening in the archives. So I thought, well, we'll talk about this. So I did that interview in October of 2019, and it kind of took off. And I wasn't expecting that. The phone started to ring quite a bit, and the emails started to come in. And so just as a few examples here, I gave an interview to Vice magazine, which I confess I hadn't heard of. My teenage daughters and my much more culturally, well, my much more conscious of these things husband tuned that apprised me of what it was. Like, that's a pretty big deal. Like, okay, great. So interview with Vice. Researcher and ufologist Grant Cameron came into the archives and did a series of YouTube videos, and that gave us a bit more fame. There were articles kind of all over the place. Coast to Coast AM did something on it. I did an interview on the Howard Hughes Unexplained talk show in the UK, did my first podcast with UFO Garage, a couple of guys somewhere in the States who were supposed to send me a t-shirt and they never did. So if they ever see this, once it's up on YouTube, guys, I want my t-shirt. I'm a medium. I'm waiting. Can't remember their names, but they owe me a t-shirt. And then we also started to get, which was really nice, a lot of thank yous from people all over the world. Really, they had read something, probably the Vice article, and just said, you know, thanks for taking the records. Really glad that it's being preserved. And I like the little comment on the bottom. I feel really sorry for the woman who's doing Stanton's archives. Like, don't feel sorry. It's huge, but it's so interesting. So interesting. So, okay, so that's our little bit of fame. And now I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the records. And I wanted to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions at the end. So let's flip through my notes. And I wanted to point out that these two images that you see in front of us are actually two of the artifacts that came to us with the collection. I don't know if these are on display at the museum or if those ones are, okay. And they were photographed by a summer student who is now working on contract with us for a year, Jules Keenan, recent graduate of the New Brunswick Community College, great photographer, did my daughter's prom photos. If you're looking for a photographer, she's a good one. There's my plug. So yes, so these are two of the artifacts that we have, and our conservators made special boxes to store them. Okay, so I'll talk about the publications series very quickly. So many magazines, and magazines I had no idea existed. And going back, I would say to the 1950s. I wish I knew how he acquired them. I mean, maybe he just started subscribing to them right from the get-go. I don't know. But we have a pretty decent list of the magazines at this stage. So UFO Magazine, the Flying Saucer Review. What else do we have here? Lots of newsletters. So the Canadian Ufologist, Saucer Smear, one of my personal favorites. But a lot of those like mimeographed ones too. So like just little organizations and societies across, mostly in the United States, I found were the ones that he acquired, and he would have copies of them. I don't know if these exist elsewhere. Because some of them are, 50s, 60s, 1970s. I don't know if there's another repository that has them. We don't have a list of the newsletters yet, but that's definitely on my radar because they're really interesting. And then things like you see in the center picture, what to do if you see a UFO. Also, a lot of journals and the proceedings of symposiums for the Mutual UFO Network, Journal of UFO Studies, tons of these, yeah, just a lot, and things in different languages as well. So I think people sent him things from all over the world, but he probably picked them up when he was doing lecture series as well. So pretty vast collection there. I should mention that that series does not include things that he wrote. That's separate. These are publications that he did not write. They're just ones that he had for information. I don't have a picture up for personal records because this is the one series that is, for the time being, completely restricted. And that's because it's family stuff. And when a personal records or when records like this are donated to the provincial archives, there's a conversation back and forth with the individual. But in this case, also with the family, because Stanton passed away before we had processed the records. And it's their wish, and I agree 100% with them, that there should be a bit of a time lapse before the records in the personal series are completely open to the public. So just for the time being, those are on hold. But it contains things like family correspondence with his parents, going way back, things about his kids who are living, things like that. So just, it exists. It will be available someday, just not in the immediate future. Fan mail. This one is so much fun. So much fun. Thousands of these letters from all over the world, in many different languages as well. And you can probably guess that it's not always easy to slot the records into one specific category, because fan mail could cover all sorts of different topics. And maybe he ended up using some of it for research as well. So we just have to make a judgment call as we go through. Typically fan mail, then, the way that we're deciding what's fan mail is the tone, the overall tone. Fan mail generally does not include anything about a personal encounter. It's more newsy or kind of chatty in tone. So here's one. Dear Stanton, it was a pleasure to meet you at the symposium in Austin, Texas last July, where you autographed my purchase of Crash at Corona. And then they start to talk a little bit, like giving their opinion on some things. Firstly, with regard to the MJ12 document, I have never really, or doesn't believe the explanation is adequate, so they're giving their opinion on things that Stanton was interested in. So that's the tone of the fan mail. It's just, I saw you, love you, that's great. Sometimes they would have attachments, like maybe a photograph of them shaking hands that somebody took for them, so themselves and Stanton. But so often photographs were separated from the original letter at some point. So we've got boxes of photographs that we don't know the context for. So you can imagine how much fun that is. We'll get there. We'll get there eventually. So that's fan mail. Personal encounter stories. So first-hand accounts of some sort of an encounter. And there's hundreds, probably thousands of these as well. Again, all over the world, all age groups. There's letters from children, there's letters from adults, everything in between. And they vary widely, very widely, not just geographically, but in their nature. So there's quite a few that start out with, I am a retired nurse, or a retired teacher or a retired whatever. I do not believe in UFOs. I have never believed in life on other planets. I don't believe any of this stuff, but I saw something and I thought you should know. That's the general tone of a lot of these. And then there's letters, lengthy accounts from people. Some of them wrote to him repeatedly about things that they experienced over the course of their lifetime. Some letters are very factual, straightforward. I was driving, like this one. I said to you I was driving on November 3rd, Sunday, between 5:35 and 5:50 on Royal Road. So that's nearby, towards the city. Here's my map. I had my 3-year-old son, and I'm sorry I cut that off, but you know, they saw something. So that's the tone of quite a few of them. But some of them are, I guess I'd categorize them as being a bit more rambling. Some of them are very much geared towards conspiracy theories or very religious in tone. So there's a wide variety here. Many of them have hand-drawn images or hand-drawn maps. This is where I was. This is what I saw. This is even, they try to express their emotions in a drawing as well. And again, on rare occasions, there's photographs of things like charred ground or an object in the sky, sometimes attached to the letter, sometimes not. And every now and then a little vial of something, which we don't know what it is. So granting access to these sorts of records, again, is going to take some very careful thought. Again, it was Stanton's wish for us to put it all out there, but I'm sure that if he were still alive when we got to this stage of sorting, I'm sure he would agree that we do need to protect privacy of individuals in this case, because in quite a few cases, the information relayed is of a very personal nature. Perhaps the person was fine confiding that information to Stanton, but didn't necessarily want other people to know, and we need to respect that. So in this case, when somebody requests access, redaction is going to be necessary so that there's nothing personally identifiable, and that will be very time consuming. But that's a bridge that we'll cross when we get to it. Research. This is undoubtedly the largest series, and it's the most unwieldy because this is the series where he was making the most copies. There's copies everywhere, and they are exact duplicates. We look very carefully. And it's because I suspect he was asked for copies of things all the time. They'd write to him, or he'd be at a conference. Can I have a copy of this document that you referenced in your lecture? He has a copy. He sends it away. There it is. So I suspect that's why this one is so unwieldy and pages everywhere. Quite a few of the documents in this series he's annotated in some way, and you can see that in this slide up in the upper right-hand corner. Claim that there is no volume 2. So they claim there's no volume 2, but that says volume 2. I don't know the context of this. I'm sure I will eventually. Maybe some people listening know what the context of this request is. But this is the type of thing that we are seeing. So this series includes things like newspaper clippings, things that were printed off the internet, lots of correspondence with archives and documents that were sent to him from archives, freedom of information requests from all over the place, documents that were sent to him from other interested people that they thought that he might find interesting. So it's vast. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say this will probably take up half of the entire collection in the end. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to tackle that, because I think this one might need to be topical, might need to be done by topic. But we'll just have to see how that goes. Yeah, and here's a few more examples of the types of things. So he would have probably put in a right to information request or freedom of information for the modern Army record keeping system. And of course, Project Blue Book, many copies of that. And then we have the series that we call Science Stan. And it's just because it's earlier in his career, or it's other parts of his career that are not directly related to his career with UFOs. So there's documents here. He, for a while, was doing radon testing in Fredericton. So there's a lot of documentation about that. Here's something with the Nickel Development Institute, and he was looking at, I think it was radiation and food. So that was another topic that he was very interested in. Fair bit of stuff about nutrition and other health topics in the collection as well. This is not a large portion at all of the fonds, so hopefully will be processed. It shouldn't be too onerous to go through. Friends and foes, another really interesting one. We started to notice as we were going through that certain names kept popping up again and again. And for people who were really immersed in the topic, they would have known these names like right away. So Philip, I think it's pronounced Klaas. Lots of the correspondence with him, Carl Sagan, Kevin Randalls, Bob Lazar, Bill Moore. So just regular correspondence. We started to separate those separate them separately from, we knew it wasn't fan mail. It is it could be research, but a lot of the time it's personal in nature too. So we've made it its own series. So friends, people he'd had a friendly relationship with, and foes is too strong. It's not foes, but boy, there's some real good zingers there. When he didn't agree with somebody, he could make his point. And it was sometimes just wicked funny. Sometimes we're just cracking up down there. Like he had a real way with words, and that comes through loud and clear in so many of his records. And this is another example. So somebody named Richard, I can't think Richard. Shoot, I can't read that. I need bifocals. So sent him this 40 years of UFO reports in the New York Times, and then attached a little personal note to it as well. And that was a name that they had a regular correspondence going on. So we'll eventually have those things all together. Yeah, please send me your thoughts. And then we have records promoting himself as a speaker and as a researcher. Informally, we call this promo stan, but it's promotional and career. Really interesting stuff, because it was quite a career. And we've got records going fairly early, some things from the 60s, fair bit from the 70s, all the way up to the very end. Actually, one of the more poignant things that we picked up was the itinerary for his last trip. So we've got the itinerary for the flight that he was on when he passed away. So you can see the flying saucers for scientific papers, lots of copies of this, because he would sell them for $3. You can see that in the corner there. So we include this in Promo Stan. Here's the schedule for the 6th Great UFO Alien and Abduction Congress in 1995 in New Jersey. Tons, like so many itineraries like this. I think he must have kept them for just about every single place that he went. So it really gives you quite an idea of the vast scope of conferences like these that go on all over the world, and who the speakers were and what the topics are. So of course we're keeping all of those, and those will be organized chronologically. It's a dream of mine that we'll be able to put things together by conference, but I just don't know. I haven't seen too many of his speaking notes, to be honest. I know we do have some electronically, And we have electronic files. We made contact with very helpful gentleman who saved Stan's hard drives for him on several occasions. Stan was not a technology wizard, that was quite clear. And so we got the backups. And so we have those records as well. Yeah, and these are fairly early. These are some drafts, could be speaking notes, could be for, I think it was probably for a paper that he was publishing. So there's a fair bit of this sort of thing as well. Yeah, and there's some more drafts, and the picture on the right, these were updated fairly regularly, but this is a piece of paper that he would give to people promoting his services. For this one, it is for, he's an ideal talk show host. And this piece of paper explains why, or not guest, not host, guest. Dynamic nuclear physicist, lecturer, author Stanton T. Friedman is an ideal talk show guest because, and then it lists all the reasons why he was. And I like the sentence at the bottom, why settle for the rest when you can get the best? So yeah, lots of these that he adapted over time. Photographs, and I regret that I do not have more digitized photographs to share with you, like digitized photographs of the photographs, but that's a series that we really haven't done very much work on yet. We really do need to, because we're getting requests for photographs. We've been contacted, I don't even know by how many TV producers, documentary producers, and of course they want photographs. Do you have photographs of Stan standing next to Betty Hill? Do you have photographs of Stan in the 1970s? Do you have photographs of Stan doing whatever? And for the most part, we are able to find something. We can take a good guess as to the year based on what he's wearing, but they're not labeled. So we don't necessarily know where he is. So here he's holding up a heavily redacted document. So he's speaking to a group somewhere, don't know where. Hopefully we'll find out at some point. So there's quite a few boxes of photographs. And then there's the audiovisual records. And this lovely colleague of mine, Elena Cobb, has the delightful responsibility of digitizing those. So while I say we're not digitizing the paper, we are digitizing audio and visual files immediately because they are at such risk of becoming inaccessible much more quickly than paper. So I checked the other day and it looked to me like so far over 800 audiovisual records have been digitized. And there's a lot more. There's a lot more. Some of these are interviews with him that aired on various TV and radio shows, including his appearance on Larry King Live in 2004. I think he was on Larry King multiple times, but that's the one that I noticed that has been digitized. He was on the Merv Griffin Show in 1984. Videos of unidentified flying objects. A lot of these things we don't have context for because if nothing was written on the case, we don't know how he came by it. Mutual UFO Network symposiums, interviews with individuals who reported UFO sightings or encounters to him. What's been digitized mostly so far are the more produced things. So not so much those interviews that he would have recorded over the phone, though we do have a lot of those, and they'll be treated in the same way as the personal encounter stories because they are very sensitive. They can be in nature. I would also mention that Elena, my colleague, conducted an oral history with Stanton prior to his death, just a few months before his death. And they had plans to do a second one, which unfortunately didn't happen. But that has been digitized and is available upon request. You just have to email the archives and it's available. And I think this is the last series, ephemera. Everyone loves ephemera. These are the funny, interesting little doodads that he picked up at conferences or people gave to him along the way. Cards, little hand-drawn cards, all the buttons. There were so many flying saucers or real buttons that we had summer students just wearing them. It was pretty great. Yeah, lots of buttons, matchbooks, business cards, posters, name tags from different conferences, lots of fun stuff there. Plus those like the bookends, the little blow up alien doll, there's a parachute. Yeah, all kinds of stuff. And there's a few things that I'm not sure yet where to file them because they cross so many of these series. And this is the one that I'm really the most, I don't know where to put these. So these are his day timers. And he didn't keep a day timer every year, at least not that I've seen yet. And he didn't always write in it every day either, but they do exist. And this is what they look like inside. They look like that. So some of it's personal, doctor's appointments, get the oil changed in the car, we're out of milk. Some of it is obviously research related because he's jotting down phone numbers and he's jotting down notes as someone is talking to him, perhaps on the phone. He's preparing for talks, right? His travel plans are in there. There's phone numbers in there. Like where do those go? I don't know. Maybe they'll end up being their own series. And there's another, a later one, 2009. So just names, Robert Miles, Jim Morris, KUFO. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure where they're going to go, but they're interesting, and they're interesting for the information they contain, but also for how his mind worked. And so that, see how we are for time. Oh goodness, I talked longer than I thought. That concludes this part of my presentation. I'd be happy now to answer any questions that you might have, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. So back over to you, Al.
That was absolutely extraordinarily detailed, Joanna. I mean, you had us all transfixed. I mean, so much detail and putting it back together and dividing into categories that people have questions. Can you tell us some of the more interesting archival documents and or photographs, any of the artifacts? I know some of the things like those bottles of things, you don't know what's in them. What do you think was the most interesting that you've come across so far?
Well, as for the artifacts, I would have to say it's that little piece of looks like metal. And shoot, I should have included a picture of that. It was accompanied by a single sheet of loose leaf that just said, Stan, here is the piece of the Roswell crash that I told you about. And then it's just signed with a single name, and I can't remember the name. So to me, that's like, okay, I'd love to have some more context here. Will we ever have the context? I don't know. So I found that really interesting. When it comes to documents, there's so many standouts there. But for me, I think what I find the most interesting is the patterns that I see in the personal encounters. And I don't know, I mean, again, I am nowhere near an expert in this area, but the themes are the same, the drawings are the same, so many of the experiences are the same, no matter where they are in the world. And it doesn't seem to matter the age of the individual. They're the same, not exactly the same, but similar. That's what I find.
It borders on one of those, if not traumatic experience, one of those memorable experiences. You know, where you knew where you were when Kennedy got shot or the space shuttle crashed. We have a question here on the letters that were antagonistic. Now, class is mentioned quite often. As I say, I find one of the things I liked about Stanton was no matter how much you disagreed with him, he was willing to listen. And people who, in theory, from what you read, didn't like him and didn't like talking to him, they kept corresponding with him.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
I mean, I can't really in any great detail. I like probably once we have things in a sequence, we'll be able to speak more to how a relationship started and like where it goes over the course of time. But right now it's, oh, here's something from this year, here's something for this year, and whoa, the tone has changed. What happened? Because we don't know. So I do find that interesting. But what I particularly enjoy about reading his correspondence is that even when he's sparring with someone and getting a real good dig in there, he still comes across as a gentleman.
He liked a good argument.
Yeah.
That's, I think, why so many people who disagreed with him wanted to correspond. I will say, based on my own experience, that initial encounter was, I was acutely aware, because I was doing the same thing. He was checking me out. Are you somebody who's going to be an irritant? Are you somebody who's got something to contribute? Who are you? What are you? How do you operate? Oddly enough, he was applying his questions on space visitors to me, which comes back to he saved everything, almost like a pack racket. We were asked a question here, what are you doing with the duplicate materials? Are you destroying them? Are you saving them? Are you doing something else with them?
In some cases, it depends on the condition. So if it's in really poor condition for whatever reason, we are discarding them. But we have been asked by the Archives of the Unexplained in Sweden if we could save duplicates in good condition because they would like to have them. So we do have a bit of a pile on the go there. But when I'm talking about duplicates, I mean, we're talking about like often it's his resume, you know, and there's just so many copies of the resume, and like, what are we going to do with 200 resumes, right? So that sort of thing we do.
And the same thing with the questionnaires. I know he tried to send everybody out a questionnaire, and there's a zillion of them in there, most of the same.
Yeah.
We had a question from actually a comment by Chris Stiles. Thank you. The large file labeled closed in large print had the file number DRBS 3800-10-1. That file number means Defense Research Board. It was the file for UFO sightings with visual and radar evidence, which an awful lot of people inquired about.
Yeah, and so this is the type of information that makes me really want to be able to digitize more of it and do some crowdsourcing, right? So that like some archivists don't like to declare their ignorance of a topic. I don't have that problem because we can't know everything about everything, and this is so completely out of the realm of what I'm used to, and so would love to have help. But pandemic aside, it's very difficult to have people come in to help us when we don't have things in any logical order. So we'll get there eventually, but this is the type of information that we really like to have.
Yeah, I will mention to the general audience, you don't just walk into the archives and start picking through stuff. It's supervised. They don't like you photographing things unnecessarily without permission and handling things that can be delicate. There are a lot of things you have to handle with gloves in any archives. Somebody here was asking, what was the size of the staff that was sorting through all of your records? And I made the comment, it depends on how many you can hire at a given time. But generally speaking, how many staff would you have?
How many staff at the Provincial Archives? Generally at that building, I guess there's about 30, but most of them don't work with the Stanton Friedman records at all. It would be a group of people in the private sector side of the operation. So the government records people don't work on it. And so at this stage, we have been relying quite heavily on Young Canada Works interns and students. They're supervised with a professional archivist. But for a long time, pre-pandemic, we were doing what we called Friedman Fridays. And so we'd have a group of archivists like you saw in that picture, and we would sit around and spend Friday listening to space-themed music and sorting through and talking to each other because as we talked, we'd get a better idea of how to classify things and organize things, and we'd recognize more of the duplication. So right now we have one person working on it full time. And we've had one person working on it full time for over a year. It hasn't always been the same person, but there's been one body dedicated to it. And it's barely made a dent, but it's good. But yeah, I did just want to make another comment, Hal. You mentioned about the security at the archives, and that is another little bit of a concern that I have with this particular collection, because there's some things in there that people might find collectible. And I don't like to think that people have light fingers in archives, but we know from experience that it happens, not so much at our institution, but certainly at others. There was a pretty famous case in Nova Scotia a few years back. But because of the nature of the records, it's collectible. Even his signature is collectible. So we'll be keeping an eye on it once it is available more widely to the public.
The other one is Cecilia mentioned that if grants for digitizing these records are unlikely, can private donors contribute to funding the endeavor?
Yes, absolutely. And initially there was a bit of interest in that. There were a couple of groups actually who had said that they were going to start a GoFundMe, and it never materialized. But of course it wasn't too long, and then COVID hit and people's attention was directed elsewhere. But yes, that is possible. There probably was a time when digitization grants would have been more possible through different government funding bodies. But I think for the foreseeable future, a lot of those government grants are going to be focused on making records of Indigenous and Black communities, other minority groups. So that's where the funding is being focused right now, as it should be. But it does mean less funding for projects like this.
Roger that. Sasha says, have your team considered enlisting some outside help from people who already have experience in researching this topic? That might help speed things up in regards to sorting through the UFO research series by contributing their own expertise.
Yeah, we have thought about it. It's just at this stage of the game, we really do have to go through the initial sort first. And part of that is because we don't have all of his personal records separated out yet. And we have to do that first. We've made that commitment to the family. And then once we get further along, that could be a possibility. And I think it's something that we'll have to take advantage of in the future. But right now, we can't do that without doing the initial sort first.
Roger that. Chris asked, did you find the original canceled check from Phil Class?
No.
For those of you who don't know, there's a fella, this Class fella said, there's no such thing as official documents on official text and stationery that went to the President of the United States, and you can't prove it. If you can't, I'll pay you $100 for anything you find like that. Well, Stanton found, I think, 14 different documents that were verifiable, went to the president on that paper. And the guy wrote him back and paid a check for $1,000, but he never apologized. Never admitted he was wrong, but he did pay the check. I remember seeing a photocopy of that check in there, but I don't know about the original.
Yeah, no, haven't seen it.
Okay. Will you archive all of his work? Oops, sorry. Are any documents, pieces, or artifacts that have really stood out to you? Yeah, we did that one already, I think. You said one person is staffing this full time, but you actually have had up to a dozen more students working this since 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah, many hands have been on it over the last, well, since January 2019, depending on how many summer students we have available to us. What I have found over time is that this work is not for everyone. There have been students who they work on it for a few hours and they're just like, no, this isn't for me. It could be the topic. It could be because of some conservation issues with the records. Like it's dusty. Some of it has a bit of a pong to it. or they just weren't interested in the topic. So it's not for everybody. So we choose the people who work on it carefully. I have noticed we hire a lot of summer students. I think we have about 30 this year. And some of them come to the interviews saying, I heard you guys have these records with Stanton Friedman. Will I be able to work on them? And so we try to accommodate that. But with COVID restrictions, we can only have one person working in the room where the records are being processed. So that's limited us, at least for now.
Yeah, that's pretty much standard across the board for all museums.
Yeah.
Question from Tabitha. Will you archive all of his work, including his hypothesis that has no evidence scientifically?
Yep. Yeah, we don't judge based on what the records are. That's not the archivist's job. We go into it with we try to be neutral. Like, no, we have to be. No opinions on whether something is true, not true, if we disagree with it. I mean, at the archive, we have records of like the KKK, right? I mean, that's horrible stuff, but we save it because it's important and it shows a piece of life in New Brunswick and unfortunately many other places too. So we don't make judgment calls based on the content.
Yeah, the business of recording history, documenting history, saving history, all you have to do is to look around at the flags that are half-mast and contemplate, think about what they're there like that right now with what's happened in our country in the past. We didn't do it, but somebody did. And if we don't acknowledge it, that information gets lost. That comes down to my own thought on this, which I would like to ask you about, is Stanton and I had a basic disagreement. He felt that all of the creatures that came here, or all of the entities, or whatever you want to call them, were benign. And that was based on his interviews with Betty. People I have spoken to have an opposite opinion. And so there are those that are here to help. There are those that are just here to study us. And then there are those who are here for not a real good reason. And the question is, are they being divided into those categories? Are they all, these are people from, these are entities from another space? Have you put a category on that?
We're not going to categorize in any way like that, because that's a judgment call, right? And archivists we're not going to make the judgment call. So when it comes to those personal accounts, our advice from our colleague in Sweden, his advice was to categorize them or organize them by place. So encounters in Canada, and then by province, and if we can, down to a specific area. Of course, not all of them have an address on them. And then chronologically within those categories. So we'll have, Canada, we'll have the United States, and then other countries, and then chronologically within. We had asked them that question because we weren't sure what the most common way that people would want to access those records would be. So in your case, you're interested in intent. Other people might be interested in, well, is there a certain area of the world where this is happening a lot? So there's different angles that people will be interested in those records from. So that's why I think we're going to go geographically and chronologically within.
Yeah, we're being asked the question here. You said 10 years. Is that realistic? Do you think that you can get her done before then?
Yeah,
as far as categorizing and sorting stuff out?
I would, I don't know. If student funding dries up, it'll take even longer. Just as I don't know. I keep thinking of there's got to be a better way. But for the time being, we've got to do it the way that we're doing it. So
time and space.
Yeah, time and space.
Cecilia is back. Do you know of any documents being discovered yet regarding the theory that extraterrestrials may actually be ultra-terrestrials? I'm curious about what Stanton's opinion would have been on this.
I don't think I've seen anything expressing his opinion on that, but I've come across many things expressing many different theories as to what it could be. I mean, I feel like I've seen lots of things that I had no idea they existed. But yeah, that does ring a bell, but nothing to do with his opinion on it.
Roger that. And then from Chris, have you conferred with Shelley Sweeney or other archivists besides those at the AFU?
I do know Shelley. It's a small world in Canadian archives. We haven't talked to her yet because that's where your records are, correct? Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So I haven't, but we will. I talked to a gentleman in the UK early on, but so far it's been Sweden that's been sort of our main contact.
Say thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and look forward to seeing you this time next week, 7 o'clock on Thursday. It will be Kathleen Martin, niece of Betty and Barney Hill, and we're going to talk about abductions. Thank you, everyone.
Dark star in the night, glowing, moving into sight. Engines pulsing as you land. Bright star gonna make a stand.